It's been a decade since the city of Boston published its first climate report. While the conversation on climate change has expanded far beyond carbon emissions, cities around the world are just beginning to adapt their policies to address the existing social, political, and economic inequalities that have the potential to magnify the intensity of climate disasters.
Well, there's no doubt that today there's a growing consensus in the scientific community that climate change constitutes a planetary emergency. Boston, in many ways, is ground zero for some of these impacts.
We're a city that, in many ways, is doing very well, but when you get just below the surface, that success is not shared equally across all of our communities and all of our residents. We are a very unequal city, a very segregated city, and that's both by income and by race.
We are at a crucial moment in Boston's history. We must acknowledge and confront a history characterized by racism, segregation, and displacement, and must now address the ways in which these issues are unfolding in the city today.
The city of Boston needs to take much more aggressive action on two fronts. One, the city of Boston needs to be part of the solution in terms of reducing emissions, moving towards clean energy in order to mitigate the impacts of climate change. And secondly, the city needs to do more to help the residents of Boston, particularly the most vulnerable.
So there's a big disconnect between how we talk about the issue and who is currently loudest in advocating for change and who will be impacted by climate change, who's already being impacted by climate change now.
Climate justice is about climate change, but more fundamentally, it is about growing community power, health, and prosperity. This video uses the lens of climate justice to identify a series of environmental and economic vulnerabilities that are shared by Boston's communities, which directly and indirectly affect how they, and ultimately we as a city, can respond to immediate climate impacts and longer-term climate stresses. Traditionally, vulnerable communities have been classified by characteristics such as race, income, and language. In Massachusetts, an environmental justice community is one that has a median income of less than $49,000 per year, a population in which 25% or more of the residents identify as non-white, and/or where 25% or more of residents speak less than fluent English. But defining vulnerability by race and class alone leaves out many other types of individuals and communities at risk of being marginalized, such as youth, children, people over 65, those with disabilities or mental illnesses, and the socially isolated. These populations often face multiple injustices. In urban environments, this can result in communities having limited access to public transportation, good jobs, parks and open spaces, city services, safe neighborhoods, good schools, and ultimately, political power to make their voices heard. We spoke with a number of community leaders in different areas of Boston in order to paint a better picture on how these vulnerabilities are manifested around the city, and to find out how the city could be more thoughtful in addressing climate justice concerns going forward.
For us, it's not just about being ready for these weather events. It is about access. Like we talk about affordable housing, we talk about public transportation, we talk about how land is used in our community and how it's owned. And we parallel and connect those dots a lot because for us, it's the environment we work in, it's the climate we work in, and then also the weather events we're dealing with actually have a huge impact on all of those things. We talk a lot about building, a living economy, a sustainable community, and for us, it's the sum of all those parts that make it up.
So what are the resources that we need to bring in? It might require money and funding, but there are some things that don't require a lot of funding. So preparing communities for increased climate impacts is something that we could do on a regular basis and increase that resiliency.
However, building climate resilience requires time and resources, which makes it even more challenging for low-income communities of Boston. Class and race have always played a key role in defining the development of Boston's infrastructure. As a city with millions of dollars currently invested in new real estate, it's crucial to look at ways in which these projects are being carried out, which communities they are displacing, and how the resources used will have an immediate impact on our climate and our health.
Well, I got really involved in the environment because my son, who's now 30 years old, he got severe asthma from living in a house, a luxury unit in Jamaica Plain, with the luxury of mold behind the walls. So because of that, I started an organization back then to actually help people to understand how the environment, indoor and outdoor environment, is affecting our children's lungs. Those sort of things are creating toxic environments so that people can't even get involved with these movements because they're too busy trying to stay alive. So it behooves those of us who know to go out and to find creative ways to bring the message forward so that we can continue to breathe. We need our trees, like we said. Those sort of things. Those are the climate justice issues that have to be addressed, and they have to be addressed right now. We don't have tomorrow.
Whether it's food or energy or fashion or communication or design, that all of these different areas have an impact and that they should be worked on not just by a few people, but by our neighborhoods, our schools, businesses. Everyone should be getting involved and connecting with each other.
While some community leaders are fighting to keep their children safe and healthy, others are using their time to organize projects that strengthen communities and build resilience and sustainability into the fabric of the neighborhood.
You know, right now what I see are some really cool projects that are beginning to talk about how people are resilient in the face of all kinds of challenges. The one that I really like to reference is this one that we've been connected to around how we deal with vacant lots in our communities.
One day in early April, we spoke with Olmis Sanchez and a group of youth activists who are part of the Grow or Die project in Dorchester. Each season, as the weather warms, more gardens around Boston, like the Food Project in Roxbury, show us how community building projects represent much more than climate resilience.
Grow or die is pretty self-explanatory. You either grow or we're gonna die. We know that it's beyond food, and we actually want to put more community control behind owning the land. And by this, we're actually creating more beacons for Boston low-income communities to be able to fruitfully create sanctuary spaces so that they'll be able to do performances, baptisms, be able to have potlucks, etc. So we see that with Grow or Die, it's more than food justice, but actually a way of life, a quality of life that we want everyone to live.
Oh, and one of the things we hope a lot of people learn from this, it's just there are other alternatives we can do for our communities. There are other things we can do out there to help our people. It doesn't matter if you're from Boston, it doesn't matter if you're from Chicago. This is something I enjoy doing, and I will forever enjoy it because I can say I was part of this. I was here when there was basically nothing on the ground, and now we're developing something.
While community members are focused on health impacts, engagement, and resilience, development in Boston continues to expand, forcing people further and further out of the city. Simultaneously, rates for public transportation continue to rise, encouraging displaced residents to buy a car and drive into the city every day, rather than riding the commuter rail or taking the T.
Here we are in this building boom, and we are building buildings that are 20th century buildings, not 21st century buildings. A big chunk of our problem is our built environment. We have technology today that would allow us to build buildings that are between 60 and 80% more efficient. We need to make that standard practice. We are not doing that. We need our elected leaders to boldly embrace the transition to a green economy. They're not doing that.
And he's right. We have the technology to build residential buildings that achieve net positive energy production. The only thing we are missing is the political will and time. As our city begins to see these changes through a climate justice lens, we must continue to engage with one another and listen to what individuals and communities have to say.
When you look at just transition, what's the actual transition that happens? It's to creating what we're saying are these living, sustainable economies and communities.
The City of Boston is already investigating ways in which they can best address the concerns that residents and organizations have about climate change. But community leaders have made it clear that there's a lot more that can be done.
I'm not sure that they recognize the value that we bring. Once they do that, they would see how important it is to fund us and work with us, and that would be a dream.
When I think about how the city could engage, I think it is about a dialogue. They just need support sometimes. They need to reach out to work with groups like ours in a little bit of a different way. And I think if there's a process that's more connected to community-driven process, I think that's something that really, I think, begins to flip the script a little bit in terms of how we are talking about the problem and how we effectively engage people in coming up with solutions.
In order to truly get to the place where we're adapting and resilient as a society, we have to include every person in that conversation, and we have a long way to go in terms of funding and implementing and carrying out those partnerships and collaborations.
In many ways, that climate change is too big an issue just for the environmental movement. What we have to do is find a way to bring together many different people from different walks of life, to bring those movements together and develop a larger agenda and see how they intersect. And this could be all part of an effort to create an even better society than we have now. We can use climate change as a catalyst for creating a much better world than any generation has ever seen.